The United States Constitution in Article 3 talks about the federal court system. Remember, this is something new. There had never been a federal court system in the United States under the Articles of Confederation. They left court matters up to the states. Well, now with the Constitution, they had to do a delicate dance between allowing states to still function with their own court system and now creating a federal court system. So this short video will go over the basics of how to think about and how to tell the difference between the federal court system and the state court system. This tends to be a little confusing probably for most Americans, and perhaps maybe in college or law school you'll study it in more detail, but for now what we need to remember is that there's basically two systems working at the same time. There is the federal system of the judicial branch, and there's the state and county, which are all kind of wrapped up into one. So if we were to think about it this way, there's basically two ways of achieving maybe justice or making sure that the rules are followed in America. For most crimes that you think about, whether it's murder or assault and battery or stealing a car, these are state crimes. So if you were to be arrested on a state crime, let's say stealing a car, then you would go to the county court. So if you stole a car in Franklin County in Ohio, you would have a trial there in Franklin County. And then the courts in Franklin County would, if you were found guilty, send you to a state of Ohio prison. Those prisons in Ohio are for people who have violated state law. Then there are the federal courts, which are a little more complicated. Federal courts are, first of all, dealing with any kind of federal law. So if, say, you were counterfeiting money, or if you robbed a bank, or you killed an FBI agent, or you're trafficking in drugs, or you were selling illegal tigers, all across the country, then you would be arrested by federal agents and you would have a trial in a federal court. And if you were found guilty, you would be sent to a federal prison. All right, so there are basically two types of laws. There are the state laws, and if you're found guilty, you go to a state prison. There are federal laws that are passed by Congress, and if you're found guilty, you go to a federal prison. So if you look at this screen on the right, there are some of the federal courthouses in Ohio. Now, we don't have one in every town, right? Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, bigger towns will have a courthouse. We don't have a ton of them everywhere, whereas every county in Ohio has a courthouse that deals with county and state legal matters. Okay, so that's the first thing you got to remember. There are two types of laws. But for this course, most primarily what we're going to be talking about, not so much whether the laws that are created are federal or state, which is important, but mostly the courts that we're going to think about, especially with the Supreme Court, they're really looking not so much at what type of crime, is it a state or federal crime. They're looking to make sure that a citizen's rights were not violated. So there are federal courts that determine whether you're guilty or not, but that's not what most of the courts that we're going to be talking about and most of the justices or judges that are federal that we're going to be talking about do. Most of them, at least for this class that we want to know about, are going to be deciding whether or not in the process of being arrested or put in jail or in prison, were your rights as an American citizen violated? That falls to federal courts in our federal judicial system. So we know that Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution says we'll have a court system. It says we'll have a Supreme Court. We'll have other federal courts that will be created by Congress. and Congress will determine the number of those federal courts. And again, those federal courts will decide whether or not you're going to go to jail for printing fake money, but they also will be watching out for your rights and making sure that you're protected. It also says in Article 3 that Congress will determine the pay and other things dealing with the courts. So Congress does have a huge part to play in overseeing federal courts, but the federal courts are a third and distinct branch of the federal government with equal power. The same amount of power, the same level of authority as the executive branch and the legislative branch. Article 3 says there shall be a Supreme Court, lower courts. It also goes into detail about certain types of cases that these courts can hear. And it's pretty legal, a lot of legal language in that, but it also talks about treason, which is, turning against your own country. But for the purposes of this class, let's just realize today that under the Constitution, Article 3, and the power of the Congress creates a kind of a pyramid of federal courts. So if you want to be a federal judge, you have to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Why? Well, that's what the Constitution says. But they wanted these judges to be not worrying about getting reelected, making decisions that might be unpopular. So the Constitution says they serve as long as they have good behavior. So as long as you don't break any laws or do anything wrong, you get to be on the federal courts in your courtroom as a judge or a justice for the rest of your life. And there's currently around 900 federal judges. And all of them are appointed for life. I mean, you can retire. You don't have to. It's not mandatory that you stay there. You could retire and then the president would pick someone else. But if you look at this pyramid, you can see that the district courts are on the bottom, and there are 94 district courts. There are a few specialty courts dealing with bankruptcy and trade and all that, but there are 94 district courts across the United States. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there are 2 per state or whatever might equal out. It just depends on how the Congress sets it up. Some district courts might be for a whole state. Some states like Ohio might have several. It's depending on the population of that region. And then if for some reason you don't like what these courts say to you, you have the right to appeal, which is to ask the higher courts to look at your case. And of course, that takes a lot of time and money, lawyer work. It's not going to be cheap. But once in a while, the Court of Appeals, there are 13 circuits, meaning there are 13 different appeals courts that you could appeal to, which you could ask them to look at your case. Generally, when you ask an appeal, you're not really asking them to hear the case over again. What you're probably saying is that some evidence was entered into the court or the trial that we don't think it's right, or we were treated wrong during this whole process. So it's more about the process, not really about the facts of the case in these courts of appeals. And if for some reason you really have good lawyers and you have enough money, you can request that your case be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. And again, the Supreme Court being at the top, there's only one of them. They're the final say, and they have the authority to hear your case or not hear your case. They decide what cases they hear. But if they do hear your case and they decide a certain way, then that is the end. It's very rare for anyone to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't take every case that comes its way. It's selective. If it wants to send a message on certain issues, it might take a case. And if it wants to kind of come up with a decision that maybe is a little unclear, they will take the case, and that way it's now made more clear for the lower courts. But this pyramid is really set up and established by the Constitution and then Congress. So, for example, it specifically says there shall be a Supreme Court in Article 3 of the Constitution. So Congress can't change that. But a lot of other things Congress can change. The number of district courts, Congress could change that. Congress could change the pay that people get paid on these courts. Congress can determine the number of courts of appeals, so they could maybe make that 15, or they could take it down to 9. They have that authority, but they can't do away with the Supreme Court. So again, this is all the federal, and every state also has a chart like this that would say, you have your county courts, you have courts of appeals, you have a state Supreme Court, and those deal with state issues. This is all about federal issues. Okay, so mostly in terms of this court, or in terms of this class, we're thinking of constitutional rights. But again, federal crimes, those trials occur in the district courts at the bottom. If you feel like that you were treated unfairly in the district courts, or that your rights were violated, you can appeal up through the pyramid, assuming you have the time and the money for the attorneys, and assuming that the Supreme Court would hear your case. So it also is helpful maybe to look at this chart. Remember, this is the federal. When you're talking federal, when you see the words U.S., or the initials U.S., United States courts. No state courts can use the letters U.S. or United States in their title or in the name of a building. So we're just talking about federal. We'll talk more about state later. But you can see, according to this, these are the geographic boundaries for the district courts, the courts of appeals. You notice that there's not 13 on here. It stops with 11. That just because there's a couple extra that have to do with the military in Washington, D.C. that really don't fit on a map. But for the most part, you find out where you live, and that's the district, and that would be where you would operate in the federal court systems. If you are arrested for a federal crime, you would go to a courthouse in one of those districts. Or if you are then seeking the federal government, the court system, to help you out to remedy something that you feel is a wrong in terms of your constitutional rights. In this chart, you might want to pause and kind of read over this. I think this is an interesting chart. It's telling you that the Supreme Court, the court that we're going to talk about the most in this class, is really the court of last resort. It is your final chance, and they don't even have to hear your case, but they do have the final say on issues of federal law. States Supreme Courts deal with state law. Now, once in a while, state Supreme Court decisions can be overturned by the federal Supreme Court because, again, the Supreme Court of the United States is the Supreme Court of the land. So whatever they decide, it would override any decision made by a state court if, for some reason or some legal reason, they are hearing the case. But you start off in the trial court. That's really more about the facts and determining the guilt. See there at the bottom. You could appeal, but it's not really disputing the facts at the appellate level. It's more about, was the evidence presented wrongly? Were my rights violated? That kind of thing is heard at the appeals level. And again, you could ask the Supreme Court to hear your case, but they don't have to. They can decide what cases they want to hear. And you can read over this and see just how difficult it is to go to the Supreme Court. They decide. But generally, federal district courts are not going to be dealing with all of the things that you normally think of as a crime. The things that come to your mind the most, that you see on the news the most, those are generally not federal crimes, although they could be. But federal and state courts operate side by side with each other. But know this, the federal court system is the highest court system in the land, and if it's the Supreme Court of the United States decides one way, then they have the final say on it. I would say pause this, read over this chart, maybe perhaps watch this video again, and look for the second video that will deal with more specifically with the Supreme Court.